is amazing. This is the best thing ever. Anytime you have a new experience, you are bound to be creating new neural pathways. There's something very satisfying and emotionally charging about the first. When you're first, you don't have preconceptions. You're willing to think outside the box. They say they want to lose a bunch of weight. They lose the weight and the pain is gone and the motivation too. The modern solution has created a series of modern problems: diabetes, obesity, lupus, thyroid problems, and the like. And if we marry ancestral wisdom and modern technology effectively, we can create the most outstanding lives, no question about it. I do think the most compelling lives are lived just on the other side of comfort. The crew has learned that the captain might ask them to do something painful, but that there's a purpose in it. I wasn't interested in just educating. I was interested in transforming. My little girl, she's like, when we go on the plane, can we roll the window down? I want to touch the clouds.
Wow.
Isn't that awesome?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Many Firsts, the podcast where we explore the power of first-time experiences and share transformative and inspirational moments in our lives. I'm your host, Regula Fischer, and I'm super excited to be here today, or should I say tonight, in the studio with Eric Edmeades. Welcome, Eric.
Thanks for having me. I think we're going to have fun.
Yeah, I'm sure. Eric, you are a serial entrepreneur, for those who may not be familiar with you, and a globally recognized speaker. You have created some of the most transformative personal development programs in the world, amongst them WildFit, Speaking Academy by Speaker Nation, which is also one of your businesses, and Business Freedom. And very recently, you were awarded with the Mindvalley Transformation Architect Award. First of all, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Also in person, that feels actually much better than just sending a text. And not sure if you have realized that already, because I know there's been a lot going on since that award ceremony. But I would like to start with that transformation architect, because I believe it must be your dream job or dream title. And still you were in other industries before, like the film industry, I think you worked with the military, networking, and so on. So what inspired your journey of going into the personal development industry and become this transformation architect?
You know, when I was a kid in school, I often thought that I might want to be a teacher. And that's because I had an unfair number of really amazing teachers. You know, I speak to people all over the world, and many people will say they had one or two really special ones, but I was lucky. I had like 7 of them. You know, I was like really lucky. And as a consequence, I thought, wow, how much fun would that be? You know, and to play a pivotal role in the developmental stages of children and teach and all this kind of stuff. But obviously, as I, got toward the end of school, I found out that in Canada, frankly, we don't pay our teachers very well. I can't speak for other countries, but we don't. And then I think on top of that, we don't even treat them very well. And so I didn't go into teaching at that point. I decided to go into sales and business and do other things. But there came a point where about 12 or 13 years ago where I was invited to do some fill-in speaking. Like Tony Robbins' company called me and said that they needed an emergency speaker. And I had done some speaking at that point, but this was the first time I was doing a really super big professional stage. You know, it was like thousands of people and all this kind of thing. And I realized that I really enjoyed that. And I didn't think of it as teaching, but that's what it really was. But when I decided to move from this sort of accidental situation and actually make a career out of it, I thought about it like this. When you went to school, you probably had one of 2 types of teachers. One type of teacher believes that it's the student's responsibility to learn the material. And another type of teacher believes that it's their responsibility to get the student to learn the material. And I think the very best learning environment is when the right student and the right teacher meet. A student who takes full responsibility for their learning and a teacher who takes full responsibility for giving the information in the very best way. But it meant to me that when I decided to really get into teaching, initially business and then later nutrition and health and then and communication and public speaking, that I wasn't interested in just educating. I was interested in transforming. Like I wanted somebody to come in and without having to force themselves or remember, that their behavior would just be different. We know that diets don't work. We know that if you give somebody a set of rules and say, follow this for 10 days, that by day 3, they're not following it anymore. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know what I could do to create content that would change their neurology and mean that they didn't have to rely on willpower and force. And so that became my big mission, to be able to develop live experiences, internal corporate trainings, management consulting programs, HR revision, culture revision, mm-hmm. but also transformative education. And so, for example, the programs I do with Mindvalley, I have programs there on public speaking, on business, on health, and so forth. They're designed not to simply be a one-way education product. They're designed that when you listen to them and you pay attention to them, you become different.
It's fascinating what you're saying, by listening. And I know there's power in words. So I do perceive and experience you as someone who chooses words in a deliberate manner, right, to create experience. Is that true? Very consciously.
Yeah.
Very consciously. And for you yourself, then, what does that mean? Knowing all that in your own, let's say, personal transformations, do you use these concepts as well that you have come to use?
That's where they came from. Yeah. I mean, they came from first me working on my own behavioral change, and then me getting involved in doing coaching work and being frustrated by clients that agree to do certain things and then don't do them. And I'm like, well, then how could I get them to do them? Wow. And so, as a good example, when I was a kid, I drank Coca-Cola like many kids do, and I drank a lot of it. And there came a point in time when I felt like it was harming my health. Mm-hmm. And so at 18 years old, I quit. I just stopped. But what I noticed was that the people around me were blown away by that. They're like, you what? Mm-hmm. Like at 18, you just decided to stop? Mm-hmm. And so I decided to take a look at the mental process that I went through to get me to that place. Because if it got me to that place, maybe it could get other people to that place. Yeah. Same thing, 3 years later, I'm 21 years old and I have all these health challenges. And I just undertake a 30-day food experiment. And then that food experiment was so effective that my whole health transformed. And so I just figured out I have to stick with this. So then I had to take a look at, well, how do I stick with it? Because I'll tell you what happens a lot of times when people want to change their behavior. They say they want to lose a bunch of weight. Well, they lose the weight and the pain is gone and the motivation too. Mm-hmm. And so then they start eating donuts again. Right? The binge, mm-hmm. feast and famine routine. Mm-hmm. And so what I wanted to do is say, well, how do I maintain this even when I'm out of pain? And so it means you have to look at a different model of transformation than the typical one. It's easy to get people to change if you just offer them pleasure and hit them with pain, but that'll never last. You have to do something else if you want it to last. And so it really started there. It really started with, how do I get myself to change?
And what you're saying just now, that if it's easy to change people if you give them pleasure. So what that means is what you give is not pleasure or it's not enjoyable only. Let's put it this way.
No, it's that. Yeah, exactly. Look, if you want to motivate a child in the short term, offer them some money or candy or a new video game or something. Mm-hmm. And then if they don't do it, threaten to ground them and take away their digital privileges. Fine. You'll be able to modify their behavior for an hour or two, maybe a day or two. Yeah. But at the end of the day, they're going to rebel back against that. What you really want to do is try to figure out how to actually change their behavior, not constrain their behavior with the carrot and the stick. But the carrot and the stick can still be really useful. And what I mean by that is that, let's say, for example, that you told me that you smoked. And I would take a look at that and go, well, if you smoke, there's something I know about you. And that is that you're overly focused on the short term. And what I mean by that is that the short-term pleasure of smoking is more important to you than the long-term suffering that it will create. And the short-term pain of quitting is more painful to you than the long-term pain of coughing your lungs up into the sink. Like you're not associated to the consequence. And so if I want to facilitate change for you, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to try to figure out how to move your consciousness on that timeline. I'm going to try to get you to a place where you are able to fully associate to the long-term consequence of that behavior, so that when you're weighing up the pleasure, you start to see a different mathematical equation. I mean, this is a very simplistic view of it, but that's part of the process.
I understand. And you mentioned consciousness. So obviously it requires for people to increase or expand on consciousness.
Yes.
Is there easy hacks, first steps that you found out are easy to take if someone wants to start on that journey?
There's two things that we use a lot in what we call behavioral change dynamics. The structure that we use for designing corporate training programs, retreats, seminars, digital training programs, and even when I write books, there's a structure that we use for that. And there's sort of two components to figuring out, Okay, give me your question again. I want to make sure I answer it exactly right.
So consciousness, if there's easy ways
how do you hack that consciousness position? There's sort of two ways to make that happen. The one starts with awareness. So your consciousness kind of often sits in the background because it feels unneeded. So for example, when you're eating, you just eat and you don't necessarily think it through. You're just eating and your conscious mind doesn't have to be involved. But then all of a sudden somebody tells you that there's some food dripping out here, then consciousness kicks in and goes, oh, and you behave differently and you clean it because the captain, the internal consciousness turned on and said, oh, I have to fix something. But we spend a lot of our time in this unconscious mode. And that's a very animal behavior. It's like, I'm just going to browse or I'm going to graze, or I'm picking berries. And and the reason I need to be able to do that is so that I can do that while watching for threats and opportunities. So I need to be able to have that like ability to have this subconscious behavior so I can keep an eye on what's going on. So the first thing is understanding awareness about that. And then the next thing is building somebody's conscious esteem or conscious strength. And what I mean by that is their executive function. There are many people who on January 1st decide that they will never smoke again, or that they will eat better, or they won't drink anymore, and what have you. And most of those people have abandoned those desires before they go to bed that night. I mean, Happy New Year, champagne, cigarette, food, whatever it is, right? So what that says is that there's a difference between what their higher self wants and what the body delivers. There's an incongruence, right? Yeah. So if we can first activate consciousness, we can have them see what's going on. And having them understand their own behavior, that can be really helpful. But then the next part about that is to help them build that executive function, build their self-esteem, and get them to actually follow their own directives. So I have a neat example of this for you. Have you ever done an ice bath?
Yeah, I have.
There you go. So an ice bath is great. Now, if you're talking to Wim Hof, and I know Wim, he's a super interesting guy to spend time with. I just think he just didn't grow up, but he's just childlike in every way. He's really fun. And but if you listen to Wim and the biohackers, you listen to Ben Greenfield and Dave Asprey and the various people that are in that longevity biohacking space, they'll give you all these very scientifically reformed and formulated ideas about why you need it. It causes the circulation to go in and out and all this kind of stuff. Great. But let's talk about it from a different perspective. The first time you do an ice bath, the captain, you, tells the body, the crew, to get in the water. And what does the crew say?
No.
Hell no. We're not doing that. That's insane. Polar swimming. That's insane. We're not doing that.
Yeah.
Then the captain says, do it. And the crew's like, oh, come on. Really? Come on, get in there. And then the crew puts one foot in. And the crew puts one foot in. The crew goes, yeah, do you have an idea how cold this is? We're not getting in. And it pulls the foot out. Captain says, back in. Exactly. And then the crew finally capitulates and the crew gets in. And now the crew is in the water up to the neck. We're getting out. No, you're not. We're getting out. No, we're not. Stay in. And then after about a minute, it actually didn't feel that bad because the blood has all gone to the core.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel that bad. And the crew goes, can we get out now? No. And then 3 minutes hits. And at 3 minutes, the captain says, okay, you can get out now. And the crew says, I don't know.
We don't.
It feels pretty good. Maybe we'll stay a little longer. And then finally the crew does get out. And the crew feels amazing. The crew's like, this is amazing. This is the best thing ever. And in that moment, two magical things have happened. One, the captain's command authority has grown.
Yeah.
Because the crew followed. Yeah. And so the captain's self-esteem has gone up. The captain's command authority has improved. In the meantime, the crew has learned that the captain is smart. The crew has learned that the captain might ask them to do something painful, but that there's a purpose in it. And so the next time the captain says, get in the ice bath, or don't eat that food, or, hey, you got to get to bed and get some sleep. All these things that the captain has asked for before, but suddenly the crew starts to follow.
Oh, this is so powerful. And yes, I will hear your voice now when I go ice bathing next time. But it's building trust, like internally between these two voices, right? I mean, you said the consciousness voice and the other voice, the crew voice, but really building the trust into the one that has been sitting in the background, neglected. And I think that answers why my fascination with many firsts, right? I was a bit confused by myself at first, because I felt, why am I so attracted to created first steps or first time experiences over and over again? And they can be mental, first times, new thoughts I want to create, or then emotional, physical, geographical, whatever, financial, because it's painful. But is this like, what's the attractiveness with it? But I think it's exactly what you're describing. Would you agree to that?
I think there's another component that's really interesting. Funny enough, I did an Instagram video about 8 days ago, all about firsts.
About firsts.
You saw that?
Yeah.
And one of the things about first, the expression breakthrough. So if you look at neurons, if you look at somebody having a thought for the very first time under a super powerful microscope, what you'll see is that there's this web of neural pathways over here, and there's this web of neural pathways over here, but there's no connection. And then suddenly a neuron jumps, and with it kind of creates a thread. And that thread is a new neural pathway. This is brain plasticity, right? Yeah. But if you think about it, isn't that what a breakthrough is? A breakthrough. I'm breaking through the gray matter to create a new pathway. I'm having a literal breakthrough. Anytime you have a new experience, you are bound to be creating new neural pathways. Yeah. Of course, because you've never had that thought before. And I believe that the brain responds very nicely to that. It likes creating brain plasticity. It likes creating new wiring. And so there's something very satisfying and emotionally charging about the firsts. We tend to remember many of our firsts. And we have, and often it's because the very first version has a higher immediate emotional payback than maybe the second or third. Yeah. If somebody goes to the movies and they order popcorn, the first mouthful is much better than the third, and then the fourth, and then, by the way, the last half you don't even remember eating, right? Because consciousness is checked out. Yeah. So there's something about that. And in the video, the reason I made that video is that my little girl, her mom has not allowed her to travel for the last 4 years. She just wouldn't let her. We were divorced, and her mom was very like, no, she can't travel. So, the poor little girl has missed a couple of vacations and some cool things and so on. But the funny thing is, there's actually a really positive side effect to all that. That we went on this trip to Canada, and everything was first. Everything. Like, she knows about planes, but she has no memory of being on a plane because she hasn't been on one forever in a long time. So she's like, when we go on the plane, can we roll the window down? I want to touch the clouds. Wow. Isn't that awesome? Yeah. Like, the only way you could think that is because it was your first time. Yeah. Because when you're first, you don't have preconceptions. You're willing to think outside the box. You're willing to ask amazing questions. Yeah. And then we get to Canada, and she walks outside, and she's breathing, and her breath is in front of her. She's grown up in the tropics. She's never seen her own breath. Like, that's an incredible thing. And then we thought, the sad thing is that we were at a time of year when Eastern Canada doesn't really get a lot of snow usually. And we were in Halifax, where she was originally born, and where I grew up. Yeah. And, typically we don't have white Christmases there, but all of a sudden the manifestation kicked in, and we dropped 2 feet of snow. I mean, like almost a meter in a night. And the next thing you know, she's making her first snowballs, and she's making her first snowmen, and she's making her first snow angels. In fact, she made her first snow angel from jumping out of the hot tub. Wow. Yeah. Because we had an outdoor hot tub, right? So, there is something really beautiful and gratifying about first experiences. And I think it has a lot to do with all those things, that you're creating new neurology, you're building your brain, you're quite literally building brain structure. And you're having this novel emotional experience.
Thank you for sharing that. And you just made me like the word breakthrough, because I've been thinking that breakthrough, sounds so pushy. So I liked to call the transformational steps like shifts or so, but sometimes it needs to be really like this one action, right, that needs to happen. And about the first times you're describing this, the story that you just shared about the white Christmas time in Canada, like really it opens this magical winter wonderland right in front of me, the way you're describing it. So there is something magical about first times. And obviously, I think when it's exactly what I believe or see when I observe children, that I feel there's so much magic still in how they see the world. What happens, I mean, it's still nice to see that when we see it in children, but wouldn't it be beneficial to bring some of that into adulthood? Or is adulthood, so different,
I think it really is important. The process of getting old is the process of becoming rigid. It's like, and I mean physically and mentally and emotionally. I remember going to visit my mom's mom, my grandmother, and we got to her house, and I always really enjoyed her. Like, I just really enjoyed her energy, and visits to her were amazing. And we got to visit her at one point, and this is in the last sort of 4 or 5 years of her life. And we got to her house, and we were having the greatest visit. And then suddenly she looked at her watch, and she goes, oh, my show is on.
Oh, I'm on TV.
Yeah, because she'd become rigid. She has to follow, she has to follow schedule. I lived in England for a long time, and I make this joke, knowing that that I'm stereotyping and that's wrong. But I'm going to tell you, it's kind of funny. If you ask an English person, "Are you hungry?" They look at their watch. You knew.
Yeah,
they look at. No, I'm not hungry. Like, your watch tells you that. And that's because there's this sort of rigidity around eating cycles and so forth. And so I do think that the most compelling lives are lived with a fair amount of time spent just on the other side of comfort. And that means doing new things.
First, yeah. Many firsts. It's interesting what you're saying about the clock, because I know that, having been in the corporate world for a while, I found it so curious that 12 o'clock means everyone needs to drop the pen and the pain, not the pen, but drop the pen and disappear for lunch, right?
Yeah.
And where sometimes I really feel like I'm not even hungry, but it's the time. So yeah, maybe we're not so different from the British. Now, you mentioned cycle just now. And I know that, for example, with WildFit, your health transformation program, the learning there is, and what you teach is that we go through cycles as we eat. So again, there we wouldn't be rigid. And I think now in the Western world, at least, most types of food are available at all times. So we're not forced to change, right, how we eat and what we eat. We could basically eat the same stuff all the time. But the importance of going through cycles, how is there a connection to that also when we speak transformation in general, that there may be times, where we pause transformation and then we go into it again? Or how do you see that?
First, let's talk a little bit about cycles, or in this case, say seasons.
Yeah.
So bears. Mm-hmm. We know that when the
Canadian.
Autumn, what's that?
Canadian, yes.
Well, there's bears in Europe too. They have bears they have bears in Estonia.
True. Don't destroy my Canada dreams, but yeah.
We have big bears, very big ones. You don't want to see those ones. And I'm sure you have stood in
front of them.
No, actually, I haven't. I've seen bears occasionally, but not like I have with African wilderness. I will tell you, I'm much more afraid of grizzlies than I am lions. Lions are naturally afraid of humans. Grizzlies are not. The difference is that lions have had humans for millions of years in some form, and grizzlies saw their first humans about 20 minutes ago in evolutionary terms. So they don't have a natural instinct about us. So they just see you as like, oh, look at that, a bag of meat walking around and not so much hair. So no hairballs. They'll eat you. But thinking of bears, they come to the autumn. And in the autumn, there's berries on the trees and bushes. There's root vegetables to dig up. There's honey around and so on. And salmon are running. So they're eating lots of fat, protein, and carbohydrates. What's going to happen? Well, as a result of all the carbohydrates they're eating, they're likely going to slow their metabolism slightly. They're going to start preparing for hibernation. The more carbohydrates they eat, the more carbohydrates they're going to crave. Arguably, this is going to cause them big ups and downs in blood sugar, which is probably going to make them somewhat grumpier. And that's useful because there's going to be limited amounts of berries as the weeks go by, and they want to get as many as they can, because if they don't, they're not going to survive the winter. And they're going to fatten up during that time. And that's the natural cycle, the natural seasonal response. What do you suppose would happen if we took a bear and we trapped them in a forest that only ever did autumn?
Trap them so they could still move and get the berries.
They are in autumn,
Yeah.
but they're stuck there.
Yeah.
They're stuck in an environment where it's always autumn.
Yeah.
There's always berries.
Yeah.
There's always honey. There's always root vegetables. And they just are eating autumn all the time. What do you think happens?
They would keep eating the berries and the honey. And
then what would happen to their bodies?
Yeah, they will become grumpier and grumpier.
Grumpier and bigger.
And bigger. Yeah.
And they would develop stronger insulin resistance. And so they would likely develop, say, early forms of diabetes. And they would put on an excessive amount of weight, because that's what that season is for. And humans have become trapped like that. The food industry has taken over. They feed us what they want to feed us. And they convince us that it's okay. And they confuse us when we're confused. And so at the end of the day, the majority of people living today are living in what we would call junk food fall. They're eating carbs every day. Listen, I'm not one of these like carbs are evil person. No, they're seasonal, but people are eating them every day and eating them in excessive quantities and wondering why they're having blood sugar spiking up and down. Wonder why they're having mood problems. Why they're, I'll tell you what, and I'll say this strongly, any psychiatrist, psychologist who is treating somebody with long-term depression who is not first looking at their nutrition should be sued for malpractice. It starts right there. And so when people are trapped in this stimulants and sugar and carb world, it's no wonder that their emotions become unbalanced. And so if you think of the way it would work for the bear, they'd be in fall and then the season would change and they'd end up in winter. And in winter, they'd face some calorie deprivation. They'd switch metabolic function. They would burn different fuels. And then spring would come. And all of a sudden, they'd switch again. And you see, we're supposed to go through that cycle. And if we don't go through that cycle, there are consequences.
And still, I think it may almost be scary, right? It would mean a change for many people to allow for these cycles. And it sounds to me, again, like we're not connected to a trust, into cycles or seasons or the cycles of seasons. So we're kind of artificially creating something that's more linear.
That's exactly what we did. Look, we can talk about the past, but we shouldn't romanticize it. It was hard. In a traditional hunter-gatherer environment, life was incredibly difficult. And when winter came, people died. Yeah. And remember, winter for them, for the majority of the hunter-gatherer history of ours is not snow. It's drought. It's a dry African savanna with very few plants to eat, and the hunting is scarce and so on. And people died. It was really hard. So at some point in time, somebody figured out, hey, Regula, when we were here last year at this village, at this campsite, because they moved, they're nomadic, and do you remember you and me? We were eating all those berries and we were throwing the seeds. There's plants growing there now. You don't suppose we did that, do you? And agriculture is born. Somebody noticed that we were influencing plant growth. And as soon as we noticed that, we started perfecting how to do it. We learned that scattering the seeds was not as good because the birds would come and take them. So we started digging holes and putting the seeds in the holes. Then we found that if there was too long a period without rain, that we'd lose the whole crop. So then we started figuring out, well, we're going to have to bring water to these plants and we're going to have to guard them as they're growing. Like agriculture changed our culture dramatically, from a pretty free-spirited hunter-gatherer life to slave to the plants. I think Harari says it really well in Sapiens. He's like, did we domesticate wheat or did wheat domesticate us? Because we're the ones that became a slave to the plant. Now wheat's one of the most successful plants on the planet and we took it there. But in the meantime, what did we do? We changed the seasonal function. Like all of a sudden, we don't have to starve in the wintertime anymore because we've got this evergreen, ever available storage of grains and energy. Never mind the fact that it's detrimental to your digestive system and berefit of any real nutritional benefit, but it has enough energy in it to keep you alive. And so, there were pros and cons. On the one side, we developed how to create a more consistent food supply, but on the other side, we started suffering health consequences. Prior to agriculture, you rarely saw dental caries or cavities. You hardly ever saw bone disease, and you certainly didn't see much in the way of repetitive stress injury. Suddenly, agriculture comes along, and we start having our first modern diseases.
You talk a lot about, or you make these connections back to how we used to live, which is very powerful, I find. And I know you call this the evolution gap, right?
Yeah.
Also, I would love to go into that for a bit in terms of, I feel like connecting it back to transformation and personal transformation, basically human transformation would need to catch up somehow, or we would need to change a lot to be able to remain healthy in the world we have created in the meantime, right? So how do we navigate the fact that there's this massive gap?
Yeah, so the evolution gap is a gap that's opened up between our very painfully slow biological evolution and our incredible capacity for innovation and creation. And so biological evolution happens very, very, very slowly and in response to environmental condition. And so a good example of that is that I can look at you and I can tell that you're generally speaking from Northern Europe. I can tell. That doesn't make me a racist. It makes me a realist. I can tell. You could look at me and you could tell that roughly speaking, I'm probably from mid to Southern Europe. You can tell. Yeah. And if we look at Mike Tyson, we can tell that, that he's probably from somewhere in the African continent, genetically speaking, more recently, and fairly equatorial. He's quite dark. But there are people that are even darker than him, and there are people that are even lighter than you. And so what controls all that? Well, the proximity to the sun. If you grow up in Nigeria, if you grow up in equatorial Africa, then you are going to have the darkest of the darkest of the darkest skin, because you needed to produce a significant amount of melanin to protect you from the unbelievable amount of sunlight you were dealing with. But then, as people started moving away from equatorial regions, north and south, they were getting less and less exposure to sunlight. And so they started evolving lower and lower levels of melanin to allow more sunlight in, because sun is important. You need to produce vitamin D. Sun is also antibacterial, antimicrobial. Like it cleanses you. You need that. So the further away you move from the equator, the lighter you get. And it doesn't matter whether you're moving north or south. Or I shouldn't say it doesn't matter. It happens both north and south, but because the planet tilts slightly this way, as people move south, they do get lighter, but not as light as Estonians and Norwegians, right? Yes. Now, that's evolution. And it takes tens of thousands of years for that to happen. Like, people didn't put on a backpack and walk out of Africa to Norway. The population slowly expanded there. It took hundreds of thousands of years. And in that hundreds of thousands of years, people, survived better if they were able to let more sunlight in. The ones who didn't died. They got sick and what have you. And so slowly we did that. But now we can get on a plane and we can fly to a part of the planet that has a level of sun that our ancestors haven't seen for 500,000 years. And we wonder why the sun is harmful to us. I will say this about the sun, by the way. For a lot of us, the sun became quite dangerous in about 1962. It was like suddenly there was this hole in the ozone and the sun was dangerous and skin cancer was the sun's fault. And we have to put on sunblock. We have to take a concoction of bizarre chemicals and smear them all over our skin, which, by the way, absorbs. And we're going to smear that all over our skin because we have to protect ourselves from the evil sun. Okay, hold on a second now. If the sun suddenly got evil, I mean, really evil. Like it was causing all this skin cancer. Why only humans? Why not seals? Why not elephants? Why not hippos? Why not plants that are under the sun the entire time? Why didn't they suddenly start sprouting tumors and stuff? Because the sun suddenly didn't become evil. What happened was a truth happened, and that truth was exaggerated for marketing purposes. And the truth that happened is that people from the Northern Hemisphere were moving into tropical areas and getting too much sun exposure. So a really good example of this is the country with the greatest fear of the sun of all, Australia.
Yeah.
Why? Because you took a bunch of Northern Europeans and you sent them down to an island that's in the Southern Hemisphere that has a 9-month summer. They had evolved for a 2-month summer.
Yeah.
And so they got down there and they hurt themselves with the sun and they burnt. And so there was some truth that the sun was dangerous for some people in that situation. But it wasn't because the sun became dangerous, it's because we moved. So now we've talked about evolution. Now we've exposed the gap as it relates to the sun and skin color. So the question now is, how do you close the gap?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, you have to have a proper awareness. You have to actually understand the problem. If you think the problem is the sun is evil, then you're never going to solve it because you're going to solve it the wrong way. I remember I had this boss years ago. He's a super smart guy in a lot of ways, but I tell you, man, gullible. Like we went on a canoe trip, a little canoe trip in Vancouver.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Kate, have you been to Vancouver?
No, not yet.
Well, in Vancouver, they really don't have the sun. They don't have that there.
Yeah,
it's not an available condition. You know, you can't. It's like Seattle. It's like England. You know, they don't have that there. I'm kidding, of course, but mostly they don't. So we're going on this canoe trip, and this boss of mine shows up, and he's buttoned his collar to the top. He's wearing a hat that's pulled down. He's buttoned everything out here. He's wearing gloves. He's protecting himself from the sun in every conceivable way. And he is pale like Casper the Ghost and just sickly looking. And this is a baby bathwater approach. Oh, he's from Australia, so they've terrified him about the sun. He's now living in a place that's much closer to his genetic, what he really should be doing, and yet he's afraid of the sun. It wasn't ever the sun. It was our relationship to it. So once you understand the gap, now you take a look and go, well, now how do I close the gap? Well, I lived in England for 10 years. And I can tell you, I had a number of ways of closing the gap. The one is I owned a convertible. You don't need a convertible here in Dubai. Anybody who has a convertible here in Dubai, I'm sorry, because I know some of them do, but if you have a convertible here, it's kind of an ego trip. You don't need one here. I mean, the damn thing, you can't take the roof off most of the year. Maybe at night, it's kind of nice, right?
Yes.
But in England, you know, convertibles should be prescribed by your practitioner, by your doctor. They should be, you should get a convertible right now because the sun is so rare. I did it. I would be traveling around to business meetings. Sun came out. I took the roof down and I took my shirt off. I'm going to get the sun. I need some vitamin D. My second solution was to travel a lot. I traveled over. I was in Greece. I was in Italy. I was in Spain. I was in Africa. I went to go get my sun. Now, those are the natural solutions. But then sometimes what we have to do is look at the, say, modern solutions. Well, if you're living in a place like Seattle or Bergen in Norway, if you're living in Vancouver, if you're living in England, if you're living in Scotland, then I think you're probably going to have to get vitamin D supplementation, and you're probably going to need to get some red light therapy and maybe put some natural lighting in your home. And so when we identify the gap, we first try to solve it naturally. And then the next level is to try to solve it with modern technology. And if we marry ancestral wisdom and modern technology effectively, we can create the most outstanding lives, no question about it.
Wow, this is so encouraging to hear. Is there an example that you see where this happens, this combination of ancient like wisdom and knowledge about our evolution plus the technology to close the gaps?
Yeah, I mean, there's many of them. I would say that food is a really good example. We have complete agency over food. We can make what we want, when we want. We can farm it what we want.
Yeah.
The trouble is we've gone too far. We've gone too far. We've eliminated seasons and we've allowed, I mean, look, I think capitalism it's the best form of value exchange that we've discovered so far. You know, I mean, there's definitely some things wrong with it. I think, you know, governments printing excessive quantities of money is just stealing from the next generations. And there's seriously some problems with capitalism. But generally speaking, it's done better than the other methods, except for medicine and food. Medicine and food do not work in a capitalist environment properly because if you think about food, your job is to increase profitability. How are you going to do that? Increase sales, decrease production costs. Decreasing production costs means finding the cheapest way to make the food, which means devastating the environment. You know, all these people like, meat's bad for the environment. No, it isn't. The environment can't live without meat. Like the biosphere needs it. It needs animals. What devastates the environment is terrible farming practices, whether it's meat or tomatoes, it doesn't matter. Monocrop farming, disastrous farming is terrible. So, you know, we have this like The solution is we don't have to starve anymore, right? We don't have to. There's no need for starving anymore. The modern solution is here. But the modern solution has created a series of modern problems, diabetes, obesity, and what have you. So if we combine ancestral wisdom with modern solutions, we can have complete food security and we can have health. But if we don't have the modern solution, we have starvation. And if we don't use the modern solution properly, we have diabetes, obesity, lupus, thyroid problems, and the like.
That's so powerful. How did you start your research into that ancient wisdom? Have you done that for decades now? Because there's so much knowledge. It's
kind of a funny, it's kind of a funny thing. Years ago, I found a stone tool in Africa, and I was studying archeology at the University of Bristol, and I took it to the professor, and I said, hey, I found this. And he goes, where did you find it? And I told him, and he goes, that's amazing. And we dated it, and we kind of figured out roughly what it was. And he goes, what's your interest in archeology? And I said, oh, my great-grandfather was Thomas Dreyer. And he goes, oh, well, Thomas Dreyer discovered the fluorspathe skull, which was at the time the oldest Homo sapien skull in history. And so he then said, very British thing, he goes, oh, so you've come on your interest in archaeology honestly. It's an interesting English thing. It's like, oh,
it sounds so polite.
It's very polite. But, oh, you came upon this interest honestly, like any other way is not honest or something. But the point is, what he's saying is that it wasn't really my choice in a sense. At 12 years old, holding a cast of my grandfather's discovery in my hand, I became lost in imagining what life was like for that person, for fluorspathe. It has 2 bite marks in it, and they're roughly the right size for hyena or leopard. But what we don't know is, were they the cause of death or after death? We don't know. But I have spent countless, I can say my teachers would tell you, I daydreamed a lot. A lot of those daydreams were, what was life like back then? And so I was already in inquiry about that long before I became interested in nutritional anthropology. So by the time I got interested in nutritional anthropology, I already had read lots of different books, and I was already informed, and I already understood evolution. And so it was kind of like I was prepped for it. I was meant to do that. And then, of course, one day I get the big invite, and the invite was, would you like to go meet some hunter-gatherer bushmen? And that was life-changing. For the last 15 years, I have been visiting and establishing a very warm and close friendship with one of the families in the Hadzabe tribe in East Africa. In November last year, they made me an honorary member of the tribe. It was one of the, of all the awards and accolades I've been lucky enough to get in my life, that one, that's the big one. And it has been such an honor to see their lifestyle, which we can't look, I'm not saying their lifestyle is our ancestral lifestyle, but I think it's fair to say it's the closest representation we have on the planet today.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing these stories. It's amazing. I could go on listening and asking questions, but to bring us back and start wrapping up to the topic of transformation, what transformation, and linking it to FIRST, like what FIRST would you like to see happening in the near future? For yourself, for your community, for the world, maybe?
Okay. Governments are running our countries. And governments in most countries need to be elected. And so they have to run on electoral cycles, which means that they spend a huge amount of time making big promises that they probably can't deliver upon in order to win their position. They then spend the next 2 years learning how it all works. And then they spend the next 2 years campaigning to get the job again so they can finally deliver on the promises they made. It doesn't work. And a direct example of it not working is with regard to health. You see, we figured out at some point in the 70s that cigarettes are killing people. And while I'm not a big fan of government interference, I think it could easily have been justified that cigarettes were banned or were taxed harshly and immediately instead of incrementally and slowly the way they did. But the problem is, let's imagine you're prime minister of a country and you ban cigarettes. Well, at that point, the majority of people smoked. So you'll be out of office. And those people will be angry with you. They will vote against you. And the benefit of what you've done will not show up in your electoral cycle. You see, if you ban smoking, that's not going to show up for 20 years. It's not going to save anybody money for 20 years. It's not going to prevent cancer for a long time. The damage is largely done. Here's the first I would like to see. I would like governments to understand that type 2 diabetes is optional. It's a reversible condition in the vast majority of cases, and it's an avoidable condition. It's not genetically predetermined. It's not family predetermined. Sure, those things can talk to propensity, but it is an optional, reversible condition in the majority of cases. And it can be reversed within an electoral cycle. It takes 8 to 9 weeks to turn it around. And so what that means is that a really smart leader, I believe, would be the first to say our country is going to eradicate type 2 diabetes. If a country would put the kind of effort into eradicating type 2 diabetes that they did into eradicating COVID-19, we would change the world. And I would argue that if there were no diabetes and there was no obesity, there wouldn't have been a COVID pandemic, because we needed enough immunocompromised people around to cause the spread of disease. Countries that had lower than 20% obesity rates barely suffered COVID. The countries that had over 20% had devastating numbers. So there's the first that I'd like to see. And look, whatever people believe about their political position relative to America, I'm going to say this. Kennedy is on the right track when it comes to food. Maybe he's extreme about his vaccine position and what have you, but if you're going to get mad at him for being an extremist about that, why not get mad at the people that are extremists in the other way? The people that have convinced us that we should be eating breakfast cereal and developing diabetes. I believe that they might be the one that does it first. And if they do it, hopefully other countries will follow. And I happen to believe that Dubai should be the city that leads the way all the way. We have a huge obesity and diabetes problem here, and it could be eradicated quickly. The right person just needs to call me.
I just wanted to say, and as long as governments are not doing that, it takes people like you to inspire so that we are not dependent on the government, but ideally it would happen that way. Can't wait to see that first turn into reality. Thank you so much, Eric, for making it to the studio today.
No worries at all. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everyone. If you liked today's episode, it would mean the world to us if you share it and like it, and share it with anyone who needs to hear Eric's message and the hope that gives us that we can take it in our hands as well and create powerful, healthy first in our lives. We would love to hear from you. How has this episode inspired you? What are the firsts that you will be creating for yourself as a next step? We look forward to seeing you next first time. Until then, much love and courage. Ciao.